The interstate stretched endlessly ahead, shimmering in the August heat as Rebecca Hartley gripped the steering wheel tighter. Her '98 Honda Accord had seen better days, but it had gotten her from Boise to the Nevada border without complaint. She'd taken the scenic route through the Great Basin, hoping the open road would clear her head after the divorce papers finally went through. At 42, she was starting over, heading to Reno where her sister had promised her a fresh start and a spare bedroom. The temperature gauge had been creeping upward for the past 20 miles, but Rebecca convinced herself it would hold. Just another hour to Winnemucca, she thought, where she could get it looked at. Then the steam started billowing from under the hood. She pulled onto the shoulder, the tires crunching against the gravel. The engine hissed and spat as she popped the hood, releasing a cloud of vapor into the dry air. Rebecca stared at the maze of hoses and belts, her mechanical knowledge extending no further than checking the oil. Her phone showed no signal. These remote stretches of Highway 80 were notorious dead zones. If you're enjoying this story, please subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support means everything to us. A pickup truck had passed 10 minutes ago heading east. Nothing since. The sun hammered down from a cloudless sky, and Rebecca realized she'd drunk the last of her water an hour back. She grabbed her purse and the empty plastic bottle from the passenger seat, locked the car, and started walking west toward what her map had shown as a rest stop maybe 15 miles ahead. The heat was overwhelming, pressing down on her like a physical weight. Within 30 minutes, her shirt was soaked with sweat. The pavement radiated warmth through the soles of her sneakers. She'd walked maybe 2 miles when she spotted what looked like a dirt road heading northwest, seemingly paralleling the highway. It appeared to cut through the low hills, potentially shaving miles off her trek. Rebecca hesitated for only a moment before taking it. The decision would haunt her for the rest of her life. The dirt road seemed promising at first, well worn by tire tracks, winding through the sagebrush-dotted landscape. Rebecca walked for nearly an hour, confident she'd made the right choice. But then the road began to deteriorate, becoming little more than 2 faint tracks in the hardpan, then 1 track, then nothing at all. She stopped, turning in a slow circle. The interstate was no longer visible. The landscape in every direction looked identical, rolling hills of grey-brown earth covered in scattered sagebrush, with distant mountain ranges forming a hazy purple line on the horizon. Her tourist map was useless here, showing only major roads and landmarks. This wasn't mapped territory. This was the vast emptiness between the places people actually went. Rebecca tried to retrace her steps, but without clear landmarks, she couldn't be certain which direction she'd come from. The afternoon sun was slightly to her right, which meant west, or was it southwest? Her internal compass, never strong to begin with, spun uselessly. Panic crept in, cold despite the heat. She'd left her phone in the car, thinking she'd be back within an hour or 2 at most. By the time she admitted to herself that she was truly lost, the sun was beginning its descent. Rebecca's throat burned with thirst. Her lips were already cracking. She'd been walking for hours in 100-degree heat with no water. Every survival show she'd ever half-watched told her she needed to find water, find shelter, stay calm. But the landscape offered little of any of those things. As twilight approached, she spotted something different in the terrain ahead, a vast expanse of white stretching toward the horizon. Salt flats. Rebecca had seen pictures of them, had maybe even driven past them on previous trips through Nevada, but she'd never been close to one. Now, as she stumbled down the gradual slope toward the white expanse, it seemed almost otherworldly in the fading light. The surface crunched under her feet, crusty and uneven. The salt stretched away in every direction, broken only by occasional patches of hardy desert plants that somehow survived in this hostile environment. Rebecca walked onto the flats, drawn by a cluster of scraggly bushes near a shallow depression. At least it was something, some break in the endless emptiness. That first night nearly broke her. The temperature plummeted as soon as the sun disappeared, dropping from over 100 degrees to somewhere in the 50s. Rebecca huddled in the depression, using the bushes as a windbreak, but her lightweight cardigan offered almost no protection. She shivered violently, her body burning through precious calories trying to stay warm. Every muscle ached, her head pounded, her mouth felt like it was full of cotton. She thought about Daniel, her ex-husband, and how he'd always said she was too impulsive, too quick to make decisions without thinking them through. He'd been right, she realized. One impulsive choice, taking that dirt road, had led to this. She thought about her sister Janet, waiting in Reno, probably starting to worry when she didn't arrive on schedule. She thought about her two grown sons, Alex and Christopher, back in Boise with their own families. Alex was a high school teacher. Christopher worked in IT. They were good men, stable and responsible, in ways she'd apparently never managed to be. Would they know where to look for her? She'd told Janet she was taking Highway 80, but that was hundreds of miles of road. Her car would be found eventually, but then what? She'd wandered off in completely the wrong direction, miles into terrain that no one had any reason to search. The night lasted forever. Rebecca dozed fitfully, jerking awake at every sound, the wind rustling the dry bushes, the distant yip of coyotes, mysterious scratchings that might have been rodents or lizards or her imagination. When the sun finally rose, painting the salt flats in shades of pink and gold, she felt no relief. The beautiful sunrise only meant another day of brutal heat, another day without water. By mid-morning, Rebecca knew she was in serious trouble. Her tongue was swollen, her lips split and bleeding. When she tried to spit, nothing came out. This was how people died in the desert, she realized, with crystalline clarity, not dramatically, not all at once, but degree by degree, as their bodies slowly shut down from dehydration. She needed water. But where? The salt flats were the opposite of water. They were what remained when water evaporated, leaving behind only minerals. Still, Rebecca forced herself to think. There had to be moisture somewhere. Even in the driest desert, there was some water if you knew where to look. She remembered something from a show Christopher had made her watch once, some survival expert in a similar landscape. He'd built something called a solar still, a hole in the ground covered with plastic, with a container at the bottom to catch condensation. The concept had seemed so simple on television. The sun would heat the ground, moisture would evaporate, condense on the plastic and drip into the container. But that had been a teaching demonstration with proper equipment. She had no plastic sheet, no shovel, no proper container. Rebecca looked at the empty water bottle in her hand, then at her purse. Inside was a thin plastic grocery bag she'd stuffed there that morning when she'd stopped for gas. It wasn't much, but it was something. Could she make it work on a smaller scale? She found a spot near the bushes where the ground beneath the salt crust looked slightly darker, possibly indicating some moisture in the soil below. Using a flat rock she'd picked up during her wandering the previous day, Rebecca began to dig. The work was exhausting. The salt crust was harder than she'd expected, and beneath it the soil was like concrete. Her hands blistered within minutes. Sweat poured off her, each drop precious moisture she couldn't afford to lose, but she kept digging. It took over an hour to excavate a hole roughly 8 inches deep and a foot wide. Rebecca's arms trembled with exhaustion. She placed the water bottle upright at the bottom, then carefully spread the plastic bag over the opening, weighing down the edges with rocks and chunks of salt she'd broken off during the digging. She placed a small pebble in the center of the plastic, creating a low point directly above the bottle's opening, just like she'd seen on that show. Then came the hardest part, waiting. Rebecca retreated to the meager shade offered by the bushes, watching her makeshift still. The sun climbed higher, turning the salt flats into a blinding white furnace that seemed to reflect the heat back from every direction. She could feel her skin burning, could feel her body temperature rising. Her vision began to swim. She closed her eyes, trying to conserve energy, but the heat was inescapable. By midday, the temperature must have exceeded 110 degrees. Rebecca's thoughts became fragmented, skipping from one memory to another without logic. She was 8 years old, swimming in the community pool with her best friend. She was 25, holding newborn Alex for the first time. She was 37, signing the papers to buy her first house. She was 42, dying in the Nevada desert. When she finally checked the still in the late afternoon, her hands shook so badly she nearly knocked over the bottle. But there, at the bottom, water. Maybe 2 tablespoons had collected. Tiny droplets that had formed on the underside of the plastic, trickled to the low point and dripped into the bottle. It was cloudy and tasted slightly of salt and plastic, but it was water. It was life. Rebecca drank it slowly, letting each drop coat her parched mouth and throat. It wasn't nearly enough. The human body needed at least a liter of water per day in normal conditions, more like 3 or 4 liters in this heat. But it was something. It meant she might survive another day. Before the sun set, she built 2 more stills, using the plastic lining from her purse and a disposable rain bonnet she found in a side pocket. She'd bought it years ago at a museum gift shop and had never used it, had forgotten it was even there. Now it might save her life. 3 stills, working through the night, through the next day. Even if each one only produced a few tablespoons of water, together they might give her a fighting chance. The second night was colder than the first, or maybe Rebecca was just weaker. She'd had maybe a 1/4 cup of water total from her stills, enough to keep her alive, but nowhere near enough to restore what she'd lost. Her body was already beginning to cannibalize itself, breaking down muscle for energy. She could feel herself growing weaker. Day 3 brought a new horror. Her mind was starting to play tricks on her. She kept thinking she heard cars on the highway, kept seeing movement on the horizon that wasn't there. Once, she was convinced she heard someone calling her name. She shouted back, her voice a hoarse croak, but there was never any answer. Just the wind and the sun and the endless white expanse. Rebecca established a routine born of pure survival instinct. She stayed as still as possible during the hottest hours, from about 10 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon, conserving energy and moisture. She maintained her stills, checking them twice a day, moving them to new spots when the ground beneath them dried out. She scraped at the bases of the desert plants, looking for any sign of moisture. She found a few succulents and carefully extracted their inner pulp, which provided a tiny amount of liquid, though it was bitter and made her stomach cramp. At night, she huddled in the depression she deepened with her rock, piling salt chunks around the edges as a windbreak. She tried to sleep, but mostly just lay there, staring at the stars. They were so bright out here, unpolluted by city lights. She'd never seen the Milky Way so clearly. In another context, it might have been beautiful. By day 5, Rebecca had stopped counting the hours between checking her stills. Time had lost meaning. There was hot and less hot. There was light and dark. There was the desperate thirst that never went away, just sometimes became slightly less urgent after she drank the few precious drops her stills produced. She wrote messages in the salt with her finger, giant letters spelling help that the wind erased by morning. She tried to keep track of which direction she'd come from, tried to maintain some sense of geography, but everything looked the same. The mountains in the distance never seemed to get closer or farther away. It was like being trapped in a painting. Her skin was beginning to break down. The combination of intense sun exposure and dehydration made it crack and peel. Her lips were so split that they bled whenever she moved them. Her hands were covered in blisters from digging and maintaining the stills. Every movement hurt, but stopping meant dying, so she kept moving. On day 6, Rebecca found a small pool of water collected in a natural depression in the salt flats. It must have been there for weeks, maybe months, slowly evaporating but not quite gone. The water was the color of rust, thick with minerals and salt, and God only knew what bacteria. She knew drinking untreated water from a stagnant pool could cause severe illness, could lead to vomiting and diarrhea that would dehydrate her even faster. But she was dying anyway. She used her cardigan as a filter, straining out the worst of the sediment and algae. The water tasted like the earth itself, metallic and bitter and ancient. Her stomach immediately cramped, but she kept it down. Over the next several hours, she made multiple trips to the pool, drinking as much as she could force herself to consume. Her body absorbed it desperately, cells that had been crying out for moisture finally getting some relief. The pool bought her time, but it also made her sick. She spent most of day 7 curled up in her depression, stomach churning, body racked with cramps. She couldn't tell if it was the water or just her body beginning to fail in other ways. She drifted in and out of consciousness, her dreams and reality blending together in ways that would have terrified her if she'd had the energy for fear. When she woke up on day 8, the pool was nearly gone, evaporated by the relentless sun. Rebecca dragged herself over to it and drank the last few inches of liquid, not caring anymore about filters or bacteria. She was going to die out here. The only question was when. But she didn't die on day 8, or day 9, or day 10. The stills kept producing their meager yield. She found another succulent patch and extracted more bitter moisture. Her body, pushed beyond what seemed possible, kept functioning at some minimal level. She marked the days by scratching lines into the salt with a sharp rock. Each mark was both a victory and a reminder of how long she'd been trapped. The hallucinations started around day 12. They were subtle at first. Shadows that seemed to move on their own, colors that shouldn't exist in the monochrome landscape. Then they became more elaborate. She saw her mother, who'd been dead for 15 years, sitting beside one of the stills. Her mother smiled and said everything would be okay. That help was coming soon. Rebecca knew it wasn't real, but part of her wanted to believe it anyway. She saw cars driving across the salt flats, kicking up clouds of white dust. She saw a search and rescue helicopter hovering overhead. She saw her sister Janet standing on the ridge, waving. None of it was real. The rational part of Rebecca's brain, the part that was still functioning, knew these were hallucinations brought on by dehydration, malnutrition, heat exposure, and isolation. But that rational part was getting smaller every day. By day 15, Rebecca had stopped trying to walk out. She'd made several attempts in the first week, had tried to follow the sun to what she thought was west, back toward the highway. But each time, she'd lasted maybe an hour before having to turn back, terrified of getting even more lost, of losing her stills and the small amount of water they provided. At least here she had a system. At least here she had something. Her water collection had evolved over the 2 weeks. She'd found more plastic debris scattered across the flats, a torn chip bag, a piece of what looked like a grocery bag that had somehow blown miles from civilization, a corner of what might have been a tarp. Each piece became another still. At her peak, she had 6 stills operating, though maintaining them all required energy she barely had. The wildlife watched her with what seemed like curiosity. Lizards basked on the salt chunks she'd piled around her depression. A coyote appeared at dawn on day 16, standing on a distant ridge, studying her. Rebecca stared back, too weak to be afraid. The coyote eventually trotted away, disappearing into the pre-dawn darkness. Hawks circled overhead, their sharp eyes no doubt noting her declining condition. She wondered if they were waiting for her to die. She thought about her life in ways she never had before. The divorce had seemed so devastating at the time. The end of a 20-year marriage, the division of assets, the lawyers and arguments and hurt feelings. Now it seemed almost trivial. So what if Daniel had fallen out of love with her? So what if she'd failed to be the wife he wanted? She was alive, or at least she had been. She'd had two beautiful sons who'd grown into good men. She'd had a career she was proud of, friends who cared about her, a sister who loved her unconditionally. The things she'd worried about, her weight, her aging face, whether people at work respected her, whether her house was nice enough, all of it meaningless. What mattered were the moments she'd shared with the people she loved, the laughter and tears, the quiet mornings and chaotic holidays, the ordinary, beautiful moments that made up a life. She wished she'd appreciated them more. She wished she'd told the people she loved how much they meant to her. On day 18, Rebecca woke to find she couldn't stand without falling. Her legs simply wouldn't support her weight anymore. She'd lost so much muscle mass that even the simple act of standing required more strength than she possessed. She crawled to check her stills, crawled back to her depression. It was humiliating and terrifying, but she was beyond caring about dignity. Her hair was falling out in clumps. Her gums had started to bleed. Her fingers were swollen and stiff. These were signs of severe malnutrition and dehydration, she knew, signs that her body was shutting down system by system. The water from the stills was keeping her organs functioning at a minimal level, but it wasn't enough. The human body needed more than water. It needed calories, vitamins, minerals, all the building blocks of life that the salt flats couldn't provide. Day 20 brought a massive storm rolling in from the west. Rebecca saw it coming for hours, watching the dark clouds build on the horizon, watching lightning flicker in the distance. The temperature dropped as the storm approached, and the wind picked up, sending spirals of salt dust dancing across the flats. Rebecca waited, too weak to do much else, watching the wall of rain march toward her position. When it hit hard. Rain pounded down in sheets, turning the salt flats into a temporary lake. Rebecca lay on her back, mouth open, letting the water pour directly down her throat. She drank until she felt sick, then drank more. The rain soaked her clothes, her hair, her skin. It was cold enough to make her shiver, but she didn't care. Water. Glorious, clean, fresh water falling from the sky. She used every container she had to collect the rain. Her bottle filled in seconds. She stripped off her cardigan and wrung it out into her mouth. She dug new depressions in the salt to serve as catch basins. The storm lasted maybe 45 minutes, but in that time, Rebecca collected more water than her stills had produced in the previous 19 days combined. When the storm finally passed, moving east toward the mountains, it left behind a transformed landscape. Puddles and pools dotted the flats. The air smelled fresh and clean instead of dust and salt. Rebecca lay in one of the larger puddles, letting the water soak into her ravaged skin, feeling more alive than she had in weeks. The water solved her most immediate problem, but it couldn't address the others. She was starving. Her body had consumed most of its fat reserves and was now breaking down muscle tissue for energy. She was weak to the point of helplessness. Her immune system was compromised, and several of her cuts and blisters had become infected. The rain had bought her time, but unless she was rescued soon, that time was measured in days, not weeks. She spent day 21 drinking from the puddles and trying to regain some strength. Her mind felt clearer than it had in over a week. The hallucinations had stopped, at least for now. She took stock of her situation with a clarity that had been missing. She was roughly 3 weeks into this ordeal. Her car would have been found by now, certainly. A search would have been conducted. But the search area would be enormous, hundreds of square miles of desert, and she'd wandered in completely the wrong direction from the highway. The chances of anyone finding her were essentially zero. She was too far off the beaten path, in terrain that no one had any reason to search. The logical conclusion was that she was going to die out here, and probably soon. The storm water would last maybe another week if she was careful, but her body was failing in ways that water couldn't fix. Rebecca tried to make peace with this. She scratched a longer message in the salt, this one for her sons. Alex and Christopher, I love you both so much. I fought as hard as I could. I'm sorry I was so impulsive. Take care of each other, and of Aunt Janet. Mom. The words looked so inadequate, but they were something. Maybe someday, someone would find them before the wind erased them. Day 23 brought new challenges. The storm water was evaporating rapidly in the heat, and what remained was becoming increasingly salty as the minerals from the flats dissolved into it. Rebecca was back to rationing, back to her stills, though she maintained them with less enthusiasm now. What was the point? She was dying by degrees, and all the solar stills in the world wouldn't change that. She spent more time sleeping, or in a state that was close to sleep, a kind of twilight consciousness where she wasn't quite awake and wasn't quite asleep. Time passed in chunks rather than in continuous flow. She'd close her eyes when it was light and open them to darkness, with no memory of the hours in between. On day 25, she found that certain spots in the flats, where underground water came closer to the surface, stayed damper even as the storm puddles dried up. She moved her camp, crawling really, dragging her belongings, to one of these spots. The soil there was slightly different, darker, with a subtle smell of minerals rather than just salt. She dug deeper holes for her stills. The yield improved marginally, maybe an extra tablespoon per still per day. It wasn't enough to restore her health, but it was enough to keep her alive a little longer. Rebecca wasn't sure if this was a blessing or a curse. Part of her wanted it to be over, wanted to close her eyes and let go, but some stubborn part of her refused to quit. She'd survived this long. Maybe, against all odds, she could survive a little longer. At night, she stared at the stars and thought about physics, about how those distant suns had burned for billions of years, would continue burning for billions more. She thought about the vastness of space, about how insignificant her suffering was in the grand scheme of things. Yet it was everything to her, this small struggle to survive in a forgotten corner of the Nevada desert. She talked to herself, maintaining running conversations about everything and nothing. She recited poems she'd learned in high school, decades ago, surprised by what her memory retained. She sang songs, her voice a broken croak. She told stories to the lizards and the stars, stories about her life, about her son's childhoods, about her own childhood growing up in Oregon. Day 28 arrived with Rebecca barely conscious. She'd stopped maintaining most of her stills, lacking the energy. Her vision was blurred, her heart racing even at rest. She couldn't hold down the little water she managed to drink. Her body was shutting down, organ by organ, preparing for the end. She lay in her depression, watching the sun track across the sky, thinking this would probably be her last day. The morning gave way to afternoon, afternoon to evening. She watched the sunset, the sky turning brilliant shades of orange and red and purple. It was beautiful. She'd lived 42 years and never really looked at a sunset before, not really. Now, at the end, she finally appreciated it. Night fell. Rebecca closed her eyes. She thought about her sons, about her sister, about her parents who'd loved her and were long gone. She thought about Daniel and the life they'd built and lost. She thought about all the things she'd done, and all the things she'd never do. She let go of regret, let go of fear, let go of everything except a quiet gratitude that she'd existed at all. Day 29 dawned, and somehow Rebecca opened her eyes again. She was surprised to still be alive. Her body had found some reserve she didn't know existed, some last bit of resilience. She lay there, too weak to move, watching the morning light spread across the salt flats. That's when she heard it, a sound that didn't belong. Not the wind, not a bird or coyote, but something mechanical. An engine. Rebecca's heart lurched. She tried to sit up, but her body wouldn't obey. She managed to roll onto her side, squinting against the morning sun. A vehicle, An actual vehicle, heading across the flats maybe half a mile away, moving slowly across the uneven terrain. Rebecca tried to call out, but no sound came. Her voice was gone, destroyed by dehydration and disuse. She waved her arm weakly, the movement exhausting her. The vehicle, she could see now it was a dusty jeep, kept coming, but it wasn't heading directly toward her. It was following some pattern she couldn't discern, stopping and starting, the occupants apparently focused on the ground rather than scanning the horizon. The jeep came within 300 yards, then started to turn away. Rebecca's heart sank. They hadn't seen her. She was too small, too well camouflaged against the salt and sand. She tried again to shout, managing only a hoarse whisper. She waved her arm more frantically, ignoring the pain. The jeep stopped. Someone in the passenger seat was pointing. The vehicle turned, heading directly toward her now. Rebecca stopped waving, letting her arm fall back to the ground. She'd done it. After 30 days, she'd been found. The rest happened quickly and slowly at the same time. People appeared above her, a young man with kind eyes, an older woman with grey hair and a capable manner. They spoke to her in calm, professional tones, but Rebecca couldn't process the words. Someone was wrapping her in blankets. Someone else was giving her tiny sips of water from a bottle, cautioning her to drink slowly. Too much too fast would be dangerous, the woman explained. Rebecca learned later that her rescuers were from the University of Nevada, a geological survey team out taking soil samples from the salt flats for a doctoral thesis on mineral deposits. The graduate student driving, David Ortega, had almost missed her. He'd stopped to mark a GPS coordinate and happened to glance to his left, spotting the unnatural arrangement of rocks and plastic that marked her still sights. His professor, Dr. Patricia Lynn, had emergency medical training. She'd known immediately how serious Rebecca's condition was. The radio call went out. A life flight helicopter was dispatched, with coordinates to meet them at the highway. The team broke down Rebecca's camp, gathering her few belongings, photographing her solar stills for documentation. They'd never seen anything like it, someone surviving for a month using such improvised methods. The drive back to the highway took 45 minutes. Rebecca drifted in and out, unable to fully process that she was actually being rescued. 30 days. She'd survived 30 days in conditions that should have killed her in less than a week. The solar stills made from plastic bottles and bags had provided just enough water to keep her major organs functioning. The storm on day 20 had given her body a crucial boost. Her decision to stay put rather than wander had likely saved her life. She was still within the original search area, though no one had actively worked this section after the first 2 weeks. The helicopter was waiting when they reached Highway 80. Paramedics took over, starting an IV, taking vitals, asking questions Rebecca couldn't really answer. The flight to renowned regional medical center in Reno took less than 20 minutes. Janet was there within the hour, her face streaked with tears, grabbing Rebecca's hand and refusing to let go. Alex and Christopher arrived on red-eye flights, bursting into her room with expressions of relief and terror. They'd thought she was dead. The police had told them to prepare for the worst. The doctors said Rebecca was severely dehydrated, malnourished, suffering from multiple infections, acute kidney injury, and exposure. But alive. Against all odds, impossibly, inexplicably alive. They couldn't explain how she'd survived. The human body shouldn't have been able to endure what she'd endured. The solar stills had provided a fraction of the water she needed, but somehow it had been enough. Recovery was slow and painful. Rebecca spent 3 weeks in the hospital, her body gradually learning to function normally again. Her kidneys recovered. The infections responded to antibiotics. Her weight stabilized, then slowly began to climb back toward normal. The psychological recovery would take much longer. She had nightmares every night, endless white flats, dying of thirst, while water evaporated just out of reach, calling for help with no sound coming out. The media descended on her story. Woman survives month in desert using plastic bottles. Survival experts were brought in to explain how her improvised solar stills had worked, how remarkable her survival had been. The University of Nevada team, particularly David Ortega, was hailed as heroes, though David insisted they'd just been incredibly lucky to be working that particular grid section on that particular day. When Rebecca was finally released from the hospital, Janet drove her to the house in Reno, to that spare bedroom that had been waiting all along. Her son stayed for 2 weeks, helping her adjust to normal life. Simple things were overwhelming: the abundance of food and water, the soft bed, the temperature-controlled rooms. Rebecca would wake up panicking about her stills, forgetting where she was, thinking she needed to check them before the heat peaked. She attended therapy twice a week, working through the trauma. Her therapist said she had severe PTSD, which wasn't surprising given what she'd endured. They worked on grounding techniques, on separating the past from the present, on building trust in her environment again. It would take years, the therapist said, to fully process what had happened. Rebecca's abandoned car was eventually found by Highway Patrol, towed to an impound lot in Winnemucca. The mechanic who looked at it said the problem was a split coolant hose, a $20 part, a simple fix. If she'd just stayed with the car, she'd have been found within hours. The Highway Patrol estimated she'd walked less than 5 miles before getting lost, such a small distance that had nearly cost her everything. 6 months after her rescue, Rebecca started speaking at wilderness safety courses. She brought photos of her improvised stills, explained her makeshift water collection system, talked about the mental challenges of extended survival situations. Her message was simple: preparation matters. Modern equipment saves lives, but at the core of survival is the human will to continue, the creativity to adapt, and the wisdom to know when to stay put. She partnered with Nevada Search and Rescue, helping develop better protocols for desert travelers. She advocated for better cell coverage along remote highways, for more frequent rest stops, for emergency supply caches in the most isolated areas. If her suffering could prevent even one person from going through what she'd endured, it would have meaning. Rebecca remained in Reno, building a life with Janet. The two sisters had always been close, but the experience had bonded them even more deeply. They did everything together: grocery shopping, cooking, taking walks in the park. Simple activities that Rebecca had once taken for granted now felt precious and profound. Every glass of water was a small miracle. Every comfortable bed a luxury. Every day with people she loved a gift. She started dating again eventually, though it took over a year before she felt ready. His name was William, a high school principal who'd lost his wife to cancer 3 years prior. He understood loss and trauma in ways most people couldn't. They took things slowly, building trust and intimacy at Rebecca's pace. He never pushed, never demanded more than she could give. It was healing in ways she hadn't expected. Her relationship with her sons deepened. They video chatted every week, sometimes more often. Alex brought his family to visit every few months, his wife and 2 daughters who called Rebecca Grandma Becca and climbed all over her. Christopher visited less frequently but stayed longer when he came, the 2 of them sitting on Janet's porch for hours, talking about everything and nothing. They were closer now than they'd been in years, the near loss having stripped away all the petty grievances and misunderstandings that had accumulated over time. On the first anniversary of her rescue, Rebecca drove back to the salt flats with David Ortega, who'd become a genuine friend. They'd stayed in touch throughout her recovery, and he'd become fascinated by her survival story, incorporating it into his research. They hiked out to approximately where she'd been found. The exact spot was impossible to pinpoint in the vast expanse. The shallow depression had filled in. The wind and weather had erased every trace of her month-long struggle. Rebecca stood there for a long time, remembering. The terror and pain, yes, but also the unexpected moments of beauty, the brilliant sunsets, the storm rain, the stars at night. The strange clarity that had come in those final days when she'd let go of everything, except the simple desire to see one more sunrise, the understanding of what truly mattered in life, the discovery of a resilience within herself that she'd never known existed. "Thank you," she said quietly to David, to Dr. Lynn, who was back at the university, to the universe that had aligned in just the right way to save her life. "Thank you for finding me." David nodded, understanding that some things didn't need elaboration. They stood together in the vast emptiness, two humans in an ancient landscape, connected by chance and circumstance. As they drove back toward the highway, the salt flats receding in the side mirror, Rebecca felt something shift inside her. The flats had almost been her grave. Instead, they'd become the crucible that forged a new version of herself. She was a survivor now, in the truest sense of the word. She'd faced death in its most elemental form and had refused to surrender. She'd used nothing but plastic bottles, plastic bags, and determination to stay alive when all the odds said she should have died. The experience had changed her fundamentally. The woman who'd driven that '98 Honda Accord into the Nevada desert was gone, burned away by 30 days of sun and salt and desperate struggle. In her place was someone stronger, more appreciative, more present. Someone who knew, bone deep, that every moment was precious, that every connection with another human being was a gift, that life itself was the greatest miracle of all. Rebecca never took a single drop of water for granted again. Every time she turned on a faucet, she thought about those solar stills, about collecting drops one at a time. Every meal was a feast. Every comfortable night's sleep in a soft bed was a luxury. Every hug from her sons, every laugh with her sister, every quiet morning coffee, all of it precious beyond measure. She'd survived, and in surviving, she'd learned to truly live.